Nothing is set in stone. Part 3. So there I was, lying on my bed, looking up at the ceiling with no real interest as flashes of Cadence's hurt expression haunted my mind. Until... Alex, can I come in? No, why did she have to follow me back here? I remained silent to Cadence's question. Alex, I'm so confused. Let me in, please, she continued to plead, her voice tight as she did so. The door handle moved but stopped when it hit a restraint lock, making me sigh in relief as well as despair. I never wanted to hurt her. I never wanted to hurt any pony, but it seemed like it was too late for that. Why won't you let me in? Cadence whispered sadly. She's whimpering? Cadence never... what have I done? I'd never heard her whimper before. Cadence was always such a confident mare, with a competitive streak to boot. She wiped the tears away. She was never the one crying. But she was. I could hear the muffled sniffles and held back hiccups from the other side of the door. And I think that was what made me speak. Cadence, just leave me alone, please, I asked pleadingly. My own voice strained as I forced the words out. I heard her gasp at the sound of my voice, which was followed up by her scrambling at my door, the handle moving again, only to hit the lock every time. Cadence, please. No, I'm not going away. Let me in right now, she demanded, interrupting me before I had a chance to finish. There was the Cadence I went to school with. The confident, no-nonsense mare that wouldn't take shit from any pony. To be honest, I had no idea she was really like this. I always thought she was kind of meek, shy, a love-suck puppy for shining. At least in the show. In real life, she couldn't be more different. I swear, if you don't let me in, I'll eat all of your hazelnut ice cream, she continued, albeit with a more humorous tone than before. It'll go straight to your ass, I quipped bemusedly, simultaneously hoping for her to just give up and leave. Then you'll have more to stare at, she replied cheekily. I closed my eyes briefly and let out a rather tired sigh. You see, I always loved it when we flirted like this. It made me feel so happy inside, to know that some pony actually found me interesting enough to flirt with. I mean, with me stuck in a world that had no human other than myself, it felt good to be treated more or less like every pony else. It made me feel normal. She made me feel normal, real, wanted. Those were just one of the many reasons I came to love her. I stood up and made my way towards the door, reaching for the handle but hesitating as I gripped it firmly. In an instant, the magic weaved into the door and vanished with a rather peculiar sucking sound. Cadence must have been able to tell that I was practically right next to her, save for the magical door that separated us. And thus I heard her breathing deeply, as if she were right in front of me. My hand stayed on the handle as I rested my head against the door, creating an audible thump as it connected with the hard wood. It was only then that I heard a softer thump on the other side, exactly where my own head rested. I could hear her breathe a lot easier, and although I believe it was my imagination, I could feel it touching my skin, warming it slightly. Alex? I shivered ever so slightly. Longing in that one word. It made my breath catch in my throat, my heart skip a beat. My brain remind me what never could be. But nevertheless, I drew back the door and pulled the handle down, opening it fully, revealing the young alicorn to me. She was still in the same black dress as before, but her once-before picture-perfect face was stained with purple-colored tears. Her eyes were slightly red, signifying just how many tears she had shed because of me. Her expression looked so hurt. But nonetheless, the moment her gaze met my own, a smile warmed its way onto her muzzle. Can I come in? She asked quietly, her eyes imploring me to agree. I nodded once and moved to the side, allowing her to slip past me into my room, where she jumped onto my bed and laid down on her front. I breathed deeply and closed the door before making my way over to the bed and sitting down on it. I made sure to sit as far away from her as I could. I don't want to find out what her touch would make me do. So, I said randomly, looking over at Cadence without meeting her gaze. Said mare breathed deeply for a few moments, as if she were trying to collect her thoughts. Because we were never meant to be, she said suddenly, momentarily snapping my eyes onto her own inquisitive ones. Pardon? I asked questioningly. It's what you said when we danced. she replied, her words catching for but a second before she regained control of her speech. What did you mean by that? I looked down at my bed covers blankly, not really seeing them as I thought of every lie I could to keep my secrets safe. Don't lie. I looked back up at her in surprise as she said this, only to find myself held under her intelligent glare. I can tell when you're about to lie, she explained. Don't. If you're my friend, then don't lie to me. How she was able to tell this, I had no idea. At first I suspected it was because of her inherent ability to sense emotions, rather than just love like most ponies believed. But my brain kicked in and remembered that magic didn't work on me, whether it was passive or not. Then I don't think I can tell you, Cadence, I replied, my head hanging in shame as the reality of those words hit me. I'd just told my best friend, the only pony in the world, that I loved and loved me back, that I could never explain my reasoning for us not being together. It felt horrible to me, but to Cadence it must have been like a buck in the face. Why? She asked pleadingly. Because I don't want to ruin anything, I replied. There was a moment of silence between us that could have seemed to go on forever, but then she spoke once more, another question, another clever question that kept me silent. You said you've influenced the future, but how do you know that? Like I said, I kept silence, unable to meet her gaze as I turned away and placed my head in my hands. How do I answer that? I thought wearily. I have no idea why I felt so exhausted. Perhaps it was because of all the lies and secrets I made were catching up with me, or perhaps it was the bitter fear I possessed that kept reminding me of all the consequences that could reveal my greatest secret. I felt the bed creak slightly as a certain sun pony made her way over to me. I saw her hooves wrap themselves around my stomach. I felt her nuzzle her face into the crook of my neck, her warm breath tickling my skin. Do you remember that promise we made under the Bazillion Oak Tree? She asked quietly. The Bazillion Oak Tree was the largest oak tree in Equestria and was found in the palace's private garden. It was said to have been the first of its kind, planted by the first alicorn under an eclipse. Cadence and I had laid under its comforting shade on a hot summer day. We didn't do much, just talked about what was ever on our minds at the time. We were both 16. Hey, Alex, do you think we'll always be friends? Cadence asked curiously, turning on her side to look at me. I blinked at the question in surprise, but quickly regained my senses and turned over as well. I don't see why we wouldn't be, I replied honestly, smiling at her comfortingly. Cadence gained a rather large smile herself and held her hoof out to me. My own smile widened a touch as she placed it in my open palm, her smile turning into a sigh of satisfaction as I wrapped my fingers around her hoof and squeezed gently. Then let's promise right here to always be friends. No lies and no secrets. I felt a stab of guilt for a brief moment, but nodded at her and closed my eyes happily. I promise. It's so strange, but what I remember most about that memory is the last few moments where Cadence attempted to kickle me, only to get a dose of her own medicine as she laughed hysterically, musically almost. I remember, I replied honestly. Then tell me, please, she implored, pulling her muzzle out from my neck and nuzzling my cheek hopefully. I almost couldn't do it anymore, not after that. Not after she was near begging me for answers. But even as my resolve began to crumble, I still held on to whatever willpower I had left. Cadence, please don't make me tell you, I begged, tears beginning to form in the corners of my eyes. The teenage alicorn apparently noticed my despair and instantly turned my head around to face her, to look her right into the eyes, her warm and loving eyes. I'd never make you do anything you didn't want to, Alex, she soothed softly. But this is different. I need to know this. Can't you understand why? Oh, I understood. I understood perfectly why she so desperately wanted to know. To know why I refused her affection for me when I had blatantly told her how much I adored her at the dance. Except it ran much deeper than that, as I was about to understand. Because you care about me a lot? At this, Cadence's eyes actually flashed with obvious anger. Her loving hooves left my face, and she backed away awkwardly until she was mere inches from me. And of course, I had all the common sense of a doorknob, because otherwise I would have kept my mouth shut. Or I've seriously misread the signs, I added cleverly. As if I had pressed her angry button, Cadence moved over to me as quick as a flash and slapped me. Yes, I think you really have, Alexander, she snapped furiously, not an apologetic bone in her body, as I rubbed the oncoming bruise tenderly. What was that for? I asked incredulously. Her glare was actually getting kind of scary. You think I merely care for you? She asked rhetorically. I opened my mouth to respond, but was quickly silenced by another harsh slap. Cadence, what the fuck? I was about to complain about the pain from the thunderous look on her face. I decided it was wise to remain silent. I don't just care for you, Alex, she continued, albeit not as angrily as before. She breathed in deeply and closed her eyes before opening them again and gazing at me tenderly. She moved a hoof to my cheek and slowly began to rub the now visible bruise. And despite it being there because of her, I couldn't deny how nice it felt when she soothed away the stinging pain. She smiled when I relaxed and began to lean into it. I want to be your mare, Alex, she confessed lovingly. Do you have any idea how long I've ached for you? A year and a bit, I thought sadly. A while, I guess, I replied sheepishly. Cadence cocked an eyebrow at my reply, but merely shook her head and leaned her forehead against mine, mindful of her horn. I didn't understand why at first, she began to explain, but one day I looked at you and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stop staring at you and I didn't understand why. Oh, why was she telling me this? The emotion in her voice made me feel weak. And then there was all those times you were there for me, she continued happily. You looked after me when I was sick. You comforted me when I was upset. You never spoke behind my back. You never once abandoned me. She put her hooves on my cheek and moved her face back a few inches as to let me see her properly. And me. Her expression was near tearful, something that until that day was quite a rarity. And yet she was smiling softly at me, her tears running down her cheeks and under her muzzle ever so slowly. I moved my right hand to her cheek and gently wiped away the tears with my thumb, a flash of my smaller action at the dance flickering through my mind before it vanished just as quickly as it came. Cadence's smile widened at my touch, and she sighed blissfully, leaning into my hand and closing her eyes while she began to nuzzle it absent-mindedly. I smiled at this, but suddenly remembered just why I had ran away from her. To stop us from getting any closer, and by the looks of it, that's exactly what we were doing. Cadence was nuzzling my hand, smiling and cooing ever so quietly as I rubbed her cheek. Oh, my touch was obviously so much more than friendly, and as for her touch, she tenderly explored my face with her hooves. She was so loving yet so desperate, as if she was trying to make a point. My thoughts bombarded me with this dilemma as they fought for dominance. I shouldn't do this, I'll mess up the timeline. But it's already messed up. Shining's going with some other mare. It's probably just a one-night stand. There's still hope for him. Look at her. Does she look like she wants any pony else? I should tell her. I can't just trust her to keep it to herself. She loves me. She hasn't said it, but I know she loves me. Alex? I snapped out of my thoughtful tirade and focused back on Cadence. Said mare had inched herself over to me ever so sneakily, her face being close enough for me to feel her breath on my lips. Cadence, please, we can't, I tried to explain, but only ended up leaving the alicord with a tired yet confused expression. Why? She asked. Please, just tell me why. I can't. I quickly got off the bed and stood up, walking away from Cadence, who had almost comically fell on her front. The alicorn huffed and sat up, and although I wasn't looking at her directly, I could still feel the familiar glare aimed in my general direction. Why won't you tell me? What have you been hiding from me all this time? All this time? Told you she was clever. I can't tell you, Cadence, I replied, my voice surprisingly steady for all the guilt eating away at me on the inside. Can't or won't? She asked sternly. Both. Why? Because you're not supposed to know, I replied yet again, finality heavy in my tone, not that it helped me any. Quicker than I could blink, Cadence was off the bed and right in my face, breathing hot air through her nostrils while she looked at me angrily. And who are you to say what I should and shouldn't know? She demanded icily. I distinctly remember my slight shock at her beginning to lose her temperature. I mean, yeah, she took no nonsense from any pony, but she never spoke to them with such venom in her voice. Do you really think that I'd want to know my own future? I blurted out furiously, my own anger taking root, although my mind groaned in despair for what I had just said. Cadence blinked and moved back slightly, staring at me in shock. You know my future? She asked. I sighed and pinched the bridge of my nose in frustration. I couldn't believe that I had allowed my anger to make me blurt out one of my biggest secrets. Yes, I replied with difficulty, looking at her right in the face and grimacing when her expression became temporarily excited, only to twist into a betrayed and hurtful one. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice sounding so upset. I thought we promised to keep no secrets from each other. I know, but I had no choice. To be honest, I was actually surprised how quickly she'd believed me. The fact that she actually did believe me was nothing short of incredible. But then again, she was apparently able to tell when I lied. She got off my bed and slowly trotted over to me, stopping only to put a hoof on my leg to get my attention. And my attention she got as I looked down at her, taking in her concerned expression as she looked back at me. And then she said something that I remember even now. We all have a choice, Alex, she said. I smiled at this, but shook my head nonetheless. How did I have a choice in this? Not with this, Cadence. Not with this. There was a pregnant pause between us until she breathed deeply and stood on her hind legs, wrapping her hooves around my neck, much like she had done only a short time earlier. I should have pushed her off. I wanted to push her off, to show her that I didn't want this. Want her. I had tried to ignore her hints of affection. I had deliberately appeared oblivious to her adoring touch and loving words. I had lied to her and broke our promise, just to keep the timeline safe and secure. And even though I wanted to hold her and show her just how much my heart ached for her, I still sacrificed my personal happiness for the future she was supposed to have. She was supposed to eventually love Shining Armor, not me. Tell me my future. I blinked once, twice. I couldn't believe she had just asked me that. What? Cadence's expression was full of concern, yet her eyes radiated confidence and firm certainty. I want to know why you won't let yourself love me, she replied. Love her? I hadn't actually mentioned love to her at all. My feelings, sure, but I hadn't used the L word when I confessed to her on the dance floor. But then again, neither did she, and yet her love for me was unbelievably apparent. As Shiny had once pointed out, even a blind stallion could see how much she cared for me. If I tell you, then the consequences could be astronomical, I told her warningly. The whole timeline could be affected. To my utmost surprise, the mare simply smiled at me and giggled musically when I said this. She then looked back up at me with a small grin plastered on her muzzle. Do you really think that you being here hasn't already affected the timeline? She asked questioningly. That actually shook me slightly. The show never once mentioned saying anything even remotely connected to a human, let alone me, and Cadence's wedding never had a human as a best man, or stallion. I couldn't believe that I had never thought of it before. I was so focused on trying to keep Cadence's timeline on track that I never stopped to think that it may actually be too late, especially with Cadence and Shining Armor and I being good friends already. But even so, there was still something that could happen. Cadence apparently noticed my sudden apprehension and expression. What's wrong? She asked curiously. You look... Alex, why does my future make you like this? I closed my eyes briefly as she said this, moving my hand back onto her cheek for but a moment. Because you were never meant to feel this way for me, I confessed. I opened up my eyes and looked back at her face. She looked confused, annoyed, and curious all at once. I could tell that she was about to say something, but I interrupted her and continued before she could. Because if I stopped, then I would never be able to work up the courage to tell her again. I shouldn't even exist, I continued sadly. You were never supposed to care for me as you do. You were never supposed to spend almost all your time with me. Why? She interrupted quickly, her voice laced with some emotion that I failed to recognize. I blinked at this question in sheer disbelief. Hadn't she heard what I'd just said? Because I'm not supposed to exist here, Kate. That was the third time that night she had slapped me. Cadence had pushed herself off me angrily, but kept her stern glare locked at me. How dare you say that, she growled dangerously. Don't you dare tell me you shouldn't exist here when you have every right to. You belong here. How dare I replied furiously. My anger laced within my tone was everything I had to begin to pour out of me. No, how dare you tell me where I belong? Do you have any fucking idea what being here is doing to your future? Oh, stop with the future excuse, Alex, she yelled back, tears starting to fall down her cheeks. It's not the future and you know it. You're just too frightened to admit you feel something for me. It's not that at all. No? She asked almost mockingly. Then what is it, Tell me and be bucking honest in your life for once, coward. And it was at that moment that I snapped. I rushed over to Cadence furiously, picked her up almost effortlessly, and pinned her against the wall harshly, causing her to yelp. She tried to talk, but before she could say anything, I slammed my lips against her own aggressively. The alicorn gasped in surprise at this for a few seconds and remained motionless. It was only when she began to return it that I wrenched my lips from hers and merely held her against the wall firmly, both of us panting shallowly. I moved my lips back to hers, but stopped just short of touching her again, something that caused Cadence to squirm and quietly moan in desperation. I want you badly, Cadence, I growled, a small smirk worming its way onto my face as I noticed her eyes darken slightly. Did you think I didn't notice all the signs and the hints, the so-called innocent touches you gave me? I moved from her lips and affectionately nibbled at her left ear, causing the young alicorn to growl quietly herself. It surprised me, actually. 'Cause I did. I noticed every single one of them, all the way back to since we made that promise under the benzovillian tree. I noticed Cadence's chest rising and falling rapidly, and wondered absent-mindedly whether it was my touch that made her like this or my words. Unfortunately for her, I had no intention of progressing any further past that point, and thus made it so by removing my grip and allowing her to slide down the wall. You wanted to know your future? I asked rhetorically, getting her attention, however dazed it was. Shining armor, I said bitterly. You fall in love with him and eventually get married. Cadence's eyes widened in surprise as I finished, which I suppose was to be expected. If someone ever told me that I was eventually to fall in love with someone I knew, then I'd be surprised too. I suppose I'll just have to move away, I muttered tiredly. I'll be out of your way, and if you one day start to feel something for him, and that something will save Camelot from the changeling army. Feel something was all I could say. I couldn't muster the strength to say that she'd love him. It just hurt too much. But I'd savor that kiss, the one we'd just shared. After all, it would be all I had to remember her by for a long time. I waited for her to say something, but the alicorn nearly stared into space, and so I took this look as my cue to leave and find Celestia. Although I wasn't really looking forward to that chat. It was only as I turned away and made a move that Cadence finally said something. Don't leave. I blinked in surprise and turned back around. Cadence was slowly climbing back onto her hooves, but her eyes were trained solely on me, and their expression. She had tears running down her cheeks, albeit a lot slower than before. Please, Alex. She held out her right hoof as she made her way over to me at a snail's pace, her eyes imploring me to make it and to pull her into my embrace. Cadence, Shining armor, I can't. She either wasn't listening or simply refused to, because she still made her way over to me, her hoof now close enough for me to grasp it. Please, she repeated yet again. Her voice sounded so hollow and sad, but why? I was so enveloped in my thoughts that I failed to notice just how close Cadence was to me. It was only as she wrapped her hooves around my legs that I snapped out of my trance and looked down. The alicorn had ensnared my legs so tightly with her hooves that I feared falling down if I dared to move. She placed her right cheek on my foot and was looking up at me so pathetically. Her tears were falling onto the foot she was resting her head on, but she seemed to not care as she absent-mindedly nuzzled it. I have to admit, I was in shock. Where had the angry and confident mare that had slapped and yelled at me gone? Cadence, let me go, I asked quietly, only for her to shake her head as best she could and tighten her hold around me. Cadence, please, do you have any idea what you just told me? She interrupted quietly, keeping her teary gaze locked on mine. You wanted to know, Cadence, I reminded her bitterly, and now you know that you and Shining will... No! She yelled loudly, actually using the Royal Camelot voice for the first time. She let go of my legs and stood on her hind ones so quickly that I just barely had enough time to blink. Her hooves pressed against the side of my head and then pulled my face towards her. And then her lips were suddenly pressing against my own as she caressed them with everything she had. I tried to pull back, but her hooves around the back of my head kept me still. I felt her tongue flicking against my teeth and instinctively opened my mouth, turning our once innocent kiss into a passionate fight for dominance. And I let it happen. What else could I do? After what felt like forever, Cadence slowly removed her lips from my own with a soft, squelching sound, a small string of saliva linking us together before it broke. I wiped away her mouth gently with my thumb, while she licked the slight drool away, uncaring of how distasteful it may have been. She sniffed sadly and looked into my eyes, her twinkling nowhere to be found as I stared back. "I don't love shining," she whispered truthfully. "Maybe not yet," I replied, "but without me to interfere, it can still happen." Cadence merely smiled and shook her head slowly, looking at me all the while. "I don't love him," she repeated, "but he's your future." At this she actually giggled and gave me a quick but intense kiss before pulling back and sighing happily. "No, he's not, Alex," she denied fervently. "I don't care who told you this, and I don't care if it's true, because right now all I want in my future is you." I actually felt my eyes becoming moist as she confessed this. Never in all my life had I felt so wanted, and the way she sounded and looked so sincere. I blinked away any oncoming tears and merely stared at her. I had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. I mean, she was denying her future, but was it really that simple? "Cadence," I began, her ears perking up at my voice before laying flat in pressure as I stroked her mane affectionately. I want nothing more than to be yours, but just denying and destroying a happiness that has yet to happen, I don't think I can do that." Cadence looked down at the floor for all of about 3 seconds before looking back at me and smiling sincerely. "Is it really up to you?" she asked questioningly. "What do you mean?" I replied confusedly. The alicorn grinned victoriously at me, as though she had just figured out something incredible. "What I mean is what if I want to destroy and deny future happiness?" I had absolutely no idea what to say. A part of me was a tad put off that she would so easily want to destroy had what to yet come before it did. But the other part, and much louder part of me, was applauding and doing an Irish jig. Don't ask why with the Irish jig. Cadence put her hoof to my cheek and began to caress it tentatively, before sighing happily yet again as she started to speak. "Alex, I'm not gonna lie. What you've told me is startling, incredible, and almost unbelievable. But I'm most upset that you never told me about this, especially after so many years." I lowered my head as she finished. The guilt I had previously been hiding now came to the foremost thought in my mind. I was quickly snapped out of it by a hoof under my chin, raising my head once more, making me look back at her. To my surprise, however, she didn't look upset, but rather understanding. "However, I understand why you didn't," she continued supportedly. "I actually feel sorry that you had to carry this burden all by yourself." She wasn't mad at me, and that made me feel so much better. "But there's one thing you need to get through that thick head of yours," she growled in annoyance. I merely cocked an eyebrow and surely at her, although I was secretly happy that the tears had long since stopped. It hurt me to see her cry. "Whatever future you may have seen for me, it's not going to happen, and before you argue, I'll tell you why. Nothing is set in stone, Alex. Not my future, your future, or even Celestia's. I don't know that much about how time works, but I'm willing to bet my life that there are different paths for us to take, and I'm fairly sure that, like you say, I could fall in love with Shining Armor and end up marrying him. But I won't, because I don't, and I won't ever feel anything more than friendship towards him." Whoa, I'd never thought of it like that before, and to be honest, all that was ever on my mind in accordance to the timeline was making sure that Cadence fell in love with Shining. But she didn't love him, according to her, and she never would. I didn't realize it at the time, but Cadence was actually moving backwards with me, unconsciously following her. It was only when I heard her hooves hit the bottom of the bed that I noticed what she had done. "And it'll always be that way because I love you," she confessed. Cadence let go of me and climbed onto the bed, laying down on her side and using her magic to remove her dress before placing it on a nearby chair. She then looked up at me and motioned with her hoof for me to join her. I hesitated for a moment, but gave in when I saw the calm yet imploring look in Cadence's eyes. And so I climbed on after her and laid next to her with her on my side, looking at her unsurely while she looked at me affectionately. "I love you," she told me again, her voice tender and oh so sweet as she did so. She wiggled her way over to me and more or less rolled me over to place herself on top of me. We had been like this before when we had been messing around with each other, tickling and mock wrestling, not the other thing. However, her half-lidded gaze was doing nothing to cease the fuel on my imagination. "Cadence, I'm not sure if I suddenly found myself silenced by a soft and furry hoof, followed by a small lick on my cheek. "Tell me what you feel for me again. I want to know," she asked hopefully. I cocked an eyebrow at her, but moved my hand past her cheek once more, stroking and caressing it ever so tenderly as she leaned in. "I want you so much, Cadence," I stated smoothly, the words coming out of my mouth rather easily to my surprise. "I want to take comfort in you, and I always have, because even though I feared that it would destroy your future, a part of me didn't care." Cadence looked at me and smiled at my words, her half-lidded gaze becoming almost sultry at my need to take comfort in her. And by comfort, I mean love. "I love you so much, Cadence," I admitted shakily. "I don't know how long I have, but there's no pony else but you, and there never will be." Cadence's sultry expression had long since been replaced by a tender one, tears trickling down her face yet again as she took in all I had to say. "You have no idea how long I've waited for you to say those words," she said happily, smiling even wider as I brushed her tears away. She quickly lowered her lips on my own and kissed me giggling somewhat when I flicked my tongue against her flat teeth. And after we got done doing what high school students tend to do at prom night, we both flopped down on the bed, exhausted. "I love you so much, honey," she whispered. I love you so much." My heart skipped a beat at her raw confession, but that only made what I was about to say to her that much easier. "Then would you do me the honor of being my special sun pony?" I asked fearlessly. To my surprise, however, Cadence merely laughed and bit the tip of my nose playfully. "I already am, Alex," she replied bemusedly. "There's no way in Tartarus that I'm going to let this be a one-night stand." And there she was again, the bold, no-nonsense mare that I'd come to know and love. "Good, because it's not." "Good," she said, smiling softly before she rested her head under my chin and closed her eyes contentedly. I put my arms around her and smiled to myself at the warm sensation I felt inside, closing my eyes in satisfaction, not really noticing a sudden glow beneath my eyelids. What we had done was truly magical. Because of all the scenarios I pictured between Cadence and I'd never once suspected it would lead to us confessing our love for each other and then joining as one in the oldest dance known to every pony. There were going to be consequences. I wasn't so blinded by what we had done to have forgotten that. Cadence and I had now made love and were a couple. She also admitted her rather fiercely to me that she could and would destroy any notions of her in shining armor falling in love, let alone marrying me, because she loved only me. She only wanted my love and not Shining's. I had a feeling that she wouldn't tell on a pony that I knew about the future, even Celestia herself. But that wasn't the question running through my mind at that point. The question was, how would our relationship affect what could now be a possible future path not taken? Would Chrysalis simply not invade now that there was no wedding for her to ruin? Or would she just try another way, perhaps even my own wedding if Cadence and I decided to one day take that next step? What about Sombra? Without Shining there to help defend the Crystal Kingdom, what would become of it? And to be honest, I hadn't told her anything more about said kingdom other than it was out of our reach for now. What did that mean? Well, at the time I didn't know. I smiled as Cadence nuzzled my neck sleepily and decided to call it a night. I kissed her forehead tenderly, resulting in a sleepy yet happy smile from the mare. And with the satisfaction of seeing that, I closed my eyes again and merely enjoyed the comfort of both my covers and Cadence's warm body. At least until my eyes snapped open and stared not at the now snoring mare, but rather my covers. What was the problem? Well, I never pulled the covers over us, and Cadence hadn't moved enough to give me a conclusion that she had done it for both of us. But then I remembered that faint glow I had seen beneath my eyelids just before I had opened them and looked at the sleepy alicorn. Only one conclusion came to me, however impossible it was. Cadence had used magic while touching me. As for how, well, that's a story for another time. For that night was just the start of a magical adventure that I would never, ever forget. Maybe one day I'll tell you. Alrighty guys, that was the final part of Nothing Is Set in Stone by Zamariak. I want to thank you guys so much for being here with me. It really means a lot. I appreciate all the continued support. Almost at 300 subscribers already. That is amazing. I never ever thought that anybody would actually care enough to listen. But I'm really happy that I can share all these with you guys. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Take it easy.